Because I've been thinking a lot about my life in the big picture. I taught high school for 25 years, and come May is an opportunity to think back about the past year, to plan for the next year. There's a real reflective sense to the school year that I feel like I had coming up to this. So I'm going to use this onset of summer talk, the last formal program, 11 o'clock program, the rest of them start at 10 for the summer, to focus on taking a breath for me psychically, thinking about my past and planning about the future in relationship with this ethical society. And as I worked on the talk, I realized that 30 minutes was way too short for my memoirs. There was way too much I wanted to share. So maybe this is just part one of a series, but I'm not going to talk about, for example, my training to become an ethical culture leader that I had through the American Ethical Union. I'm not going to talk about my Humanist Institute program, which I took for 3 years. I'm not going to talk about the 2 years of internships that I had at the Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Northern Virginia ethical societies. I'm going to focus on some very early life experiences. And because it's relatively personal, it's not too heavy, it's relatively personal but somewhat comical, you're going to have to work harder to figure out what the heck you take away from this. And I'm going to just leave that on your shoulders to do. I'm not going to spell out a lot of answers. I have some trite lessons I will offer you, but I'm exploring on this one here. I'm going to share with you some experiences of my formative years with the experiences of disappointment, of wrestling with blame and shame and frustration and powerlessness to a degree, but the fact that I was lucky enough to be able to move by those. I'm going to talk about the fact that for me, and I think for many of us, there's a little kid in us. There always will be a little kid in us. For me, thanks to some counseling that I got, some kindness, some love, and the fact that I lived a comfortable, privileged life that I didn't earn, I was able to overcome some of that disappointment and that blame and that powerlessness. I was able to put it in a perspective that led me to live a life with greater kindness in my heart, with a sense of acceptance and humility for the silliness that our lives can lead us into. And that has helped me be a better ethical culture minister. I think I grew up eventually figuring out that I had a choice in life, that I had a choice to choose to make a difference to the world and not just be a victim to the little bumps and bruises we get when we're very, very young, which can stay in us. And as a result, I think I've been able to help other people choose in their lives better, grow more fully, and to make the world a better place. So, that's the meta theme. Victimhood, overcoming childhood trauma, and growing up to be an adult. That's what we're trying to do as a community. We're trying to grow up as a community to treat the world in a way that we are more empowered to make a positive difference. Before I get into the autobiographical stuff, which is probably as much fantasy and make-believe as reality, because that's how we tell our life stories over and over and over again, I want to explain why I chose the term ethical ministry in the topic today. I've been thinking a lot about my role as leader, capital L, in ethical culture. For those new to our community, the term leader was chosen by the founder of ethical culture, Felix Adler, to indicate the person who plays the role of the minister within our non-theist context. The person most tasked with offering talks, giving workshops, providing counseling, and leading a whole bunch of ethical justice projects in our community. And these projects can run from simply being a better person, being a better spouse, a better parent, a better child, to the capital letter issues of trying to solve poverty and many of the evils in the world. Now, Felix Adler didn't want to use any traditional terms for the person offering these services, and he thought that leader indicated a clear break from the traditions that relied on superstition or outdated religious institutions. To me, the term leader, though, implies too much that the others are followers. And that's the exact opposite of what ethical culture is about. Everybody in ethical culture has got to be a leader. And that actually is one reason why I was drawn into ethical culture leadership, because my vision of leadership is to empower others to lead. That's what 25 years of high school teaching will do. So it's up to you to lead, and it's my job to encourage that. And perhaps today I'll encourage that by talking about the fact that we all have a little kid in us. And we always have to love that kid and continue to help that kid grow up a little bit. So, as I work here, there are lots of challenges as your leader. Some of them are the simple managerial issues of having headaches on financing and helping things run well. In the middle of a world that is full of greed and fear and suspicion and superficiality of the consumer life that we live. And running a small organization is hard enough, but running it when the organization has the bold mission to change the world for the better makes it particularly hard. Because you've got this huge mission and these mundane details. So sometimes I'm tempted just to ignore the big issues and focus on the details of congregational life. Because there are talks to prepare, counseling to offer, receptions to plan, cheese to buy. And this work is demanding enough that sometimes I feel myself getting bent out of shape over what one friend calls first world concerns. Like enough cheese, right? When a third of this planet lives with daily food insecurity, and when millions of people suffer every day from wars and oppressive political systems, concerns running a small congregation here on Rittenhouse Square seem petty and trivial. And that's a hard balance to maintain, to focus on both. It's really hard to balance the commitment, in fact, to work and my own needs and my own limitations. Anybody that goes into work that calls on you in a way that working in a position of a minister does knows this. Activists, idealists, people who pour themselves into their work know it's very hard to draw the line between when do I save the world and when do I take care of myself. And you have to maintain that balance. Self-care and community concerns have to be balanced against these big issues. It's hard to get rid of that little thought in your head, you should do more, you could do more to save the world and not just your small circle of friends. Not just this congregation. So that's a balance in my work here. Now, Felix Adler pointed to that as an existential challenge in everybody's life because he challenged me when I read him, certainly, to keep in my head and my mind a clear-headed awareness of the world's problems and the suffering, at the same time as keeping aware of the idealistic vision that I want to have for the world. The idealism of wanting to comfort and heal and empower other peoples in the middle of a cruel world. So to appreciate the world as it is, while imagining a better one and working to bring it into existence is hard. To keep your feet on the ground but to reach for the stars is the balance that I try to strike in ministry here. Most of the challenges are going to remain. It's just a part of life. You're not just going to make them go away. Adler said that they are in fact just a part of what he called spiritual pain. Now, I interpret this term spiritual within an ethical framework, without any supernaturalism. It's just a yearning, a desire to live a life where your life matches your ideals more closely. And I think of many people who come here have that yearning. They want to live closer to their ideals. And all of these are part of the challenges that Adler lay at our feet, to bring out the best in ourselves, in others, and in the world. Now, when I talk to people about what I do here, they're not in ethical culture. They get it when I say I'm a humanist minister. Immediately they begin to nod. They understand that, oh, well, it involves teaching, preaching, counseling, encouraging people in a close-knit community to live closer to their ethical ideals. And I'm working hard and harder, and I intend to work harder next year explaining to the rest of the world what we do here because it's pretty amazing. But it's hard to do it if they've had very different experiences. So this is a challenge that I'm going to have. Some of it's going to call me to get out there more, to be a drum major, which is part of my personality. And Martin Luther King said he wanted people to be drum majors. He said it's good to be a drum major, but it's good to be a drum major for justice. A drum major for justice. So in trying to do that, in trying to be a leader in the ethical culture movement, I want to try to minister to people Because the drum major, follow me, is not what I want to do. The drum major of we're all out there together is what I want to do. And ministry has a root that I like. The Latin root of the world is linked to the term servant. There are many secular uses of the term minister that indicate this service orientation. I mean, all the ministers we have overseas, the diplomatic corps. That's the idea of being a minister, to serve your country overseas. There are people who administer, are civil servants. They serve us. And King said anybody can be great because anyone can serve. So the verb form, to minister to, means to serve, to nurse, to attend to. It's about responding to people's needs, their calls for help, their hope for inspiration. So I want to help ward off the cynicism and the fatalism and the disappointment and the blame and the powerlessness that people can feel, including myself, so we can live closer to our ideals. So now we get to the autobiographical part. Because I picked up, Thurston. No, that's not Thurston. It is. I always like to talk about the inherent worth of every individual, and one of the ways I do is when people will often come back to me and say, oh, but you don't mean a Hitler or a Saddam Hussein, or to pick anybody that you really dislike and condemn, and think of them as a child. Thich Nhat Hanh urges a meditation on that and says, imagine the person you most despise as a baby infant, and imagine them growing up, and imagine what must have happened to them growing up to cause them to be as cruel and misguided as they are. And that calls me back to my faith in the inherent worth of everybody. And when I look at my growing up, I lived a comfortable life. What I'm going to tell you is all within the context of an economy of abundance and unearned privilege. But it also reminds me of how fragile we are as human beings. And I think that helps. Both my love of the work I do and my ability to balance my own limitations with the work that I do. So let me jump in. There is a lot of myth in this. When we retell our stories, we really are molding our future. And we read into them. But as my mother said, it makes a good story. So, let me begin. Anybody familiar with Felix Adler's perspective on life knows there's a mix of tragic and heroic in Adler's writing. And in my first story, there's a great deal of tragedy in a exaggerated, semi-comic fashion. It's called the Danny Kaye story. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and my favorite comedian was Danny Kaye. He was a silly, slapstick comedian that I just loved, and it made my mother laugh so hard that it was fun just being with her in the room when she watched him. And one night when my mother and father were going out to some dinner, they tucked me in, and my mother whispered that if they weren't back by 8 o'clock, I could go downstairs because there'd be a surprise for me. I was so excited. Dutifully at 8 o'clock, I closed my Toot Toot the Tugboat book and set it on the night table and went downstairs and leaned into the kitchen to tell Therese, who was our nanny, that I did in fact have parental permission to come down half an hour after my bedtime, and she grunted and nodded and went back to her cigarette and coffee. And I went into the living room, not sure what I should expect, so I brought down a book to pass the time, and I sat there in the living room wondering what it was. What's the surprise? I scanned around. I imagined a clown leaping up from behind a couch or something. What was the surprise? And I started to look over the book mindlessly. My mother complained that I watched too much TV, and I knew that this was a special night, so I was not going to do that. I was going to go read my book and be a good boy, earn some points, some noble points. And I just sat there, and the clock went. It was 8:15, 8:30, and I was hardly reading because I was so excited. What is it? What is it? The clock went by, almost 9 o'clock, and then I hear a car pull up and shut off, and a door shut. And another short, it's my parents, they're coming home. I thought, what could it be? Maybe they're bringing me something. So I rushed to the door, and my mother's coming up the door, and her eyes are wide, but her arms are empty. Right? So I say, I'm thinking in my head, what's the surprise? What's the surprise? And my mother says, how is it? And I say, how is it? Wait a minute, that doesn't even make it. Oh, maybe she left me a present and I hadn't found it yet, so I should have scanned the room, looked behind the couch, obviously. But that wasn't it. She said, no, how was the show? And I think I shook my head like waking up from a dream or like a cartoon where there's like boom, like that. What show? I forced it out of my lips because I almost don't want to hear the answer. What show? The Danny Kaye show, my mother exclaims. And I said, what Danny Kaye show? Getting increasingly angry, a little mournful. And she says, his TV special that started at 8 o'clock. You mean you aren't watching it? And I just stood there like I had been shot with a bolt of lightning. Is this a bad dream, I was thinking? And my mom says, come on, silly, let's go watch the end of it. And I start to moan, and I'm confused, and anger swelling in my chest. And my mother tries to calm me down by bringing me to the TV that you had to turn on. It took a while, to come on. It had to warm up. Remember that? And she said, oh, look, there he is. He's singing. As if it's not patently obvious he was singing. Of course he's singing. He always sings a farewell song. I had missed it. I had missed the whole thing, an hour to myself, a funny, silly Danny Kaye that I could have watched. How was this possible? What cruel twist of fate could have done that? Stop moaning, you'll miss his last song. As if that would make up for this incredible parental miscue. And then, she's scolding me for being suffering, blaming me for this, because she says, why didn't you turn on the TV? Because you didn't tell me to turn on the TV. But now I'm hurt, blamed for crying, and blamed for the whole event. I say in my self-righteous tone, it's not my fault. It sure felt like it was my fault. It felt like it was my fault for about 40 years. And it was a theme that I would eventually overcome, but it was a theme that kept coming back. The theme of being responsible for great disappointments, for being late, for missing things, for losing games. Which brings me to the second story of autobiographical nature, or memoirship. It's about the tragic, reinforced because I was a Red Sox fan. Like many fans, remember that's short for fanatic, Red Sox fans took personal responsibility for tragic losses, more than anybody. It's a silly suspicion, I should have worn red, and it's usually adult males that have this sense that they are responsible for their team. But Red Sox fans seem to share a deeper sense of responsibility for defeat. Bart Giamatti, who was the Renaissance Commissioner of Baseball for a couple of years, talked about it as being an example of our own original sin. Certainly New Englanders felt that way. Was it fueled or awakened from Puritan guilt? Probably. Was it bad karma? Was it fate? But it's not just that they lost, it's the way they lost. The almost Shakespearean twists of things that from the moment before victory, tragic falls from great heights occurs. It was like a never-ending video nightmare of sports. It was a sports horror film, really. I mean, there they were, one out, one strike away from their first championship in 70 years. And then that icy knife of fate as Bob Stanley's wild pitch goes flying to the backstop, and then that ball dribbles through Bill Buckner's legs. I mean, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Oh, more than I thought. Poor Bill Buckner. Poor me as a kid. We were so close we could almost taste it. But that's the tragic in life, from within a privileged life. And it usually is the case for Red Sox fans. They broke me too many times. I mean, the 6th grade bus from school, peeling the bumper sticker off after they lost to the Cardinals in 1967. They lost to the Reds in 75. They broke me one too many times. Painful loss after painful loss. And I'd like to say that I learned to get past this. That I learned to hold on to reason. That it's not some malicious God toying with me. But in fact, I simply got tired of irrational, painful affiliation that on the surface of it is trivial. It meant nothing. But boy, did it sting. So I'm going to add a third element of this sense of blame and powerlessness. My older brother John, to call him a nemesis is maybe overdoing it. To call him a tease is maybe underdoing it. Because he took great pleasure at making me furious at him. It would start the same way. He'd stick his tongue out at me, and then I would usually start to whine or scream, and it would escalate until a kick. And my mother got so fed up that she finally said, okay, that's fine. You want it? Go for it. Go, fight. So we did. And it didn't take long for me to end up with a bloody nose, and as my mother was stuffing tissues up my nose, like that, she was saying to me, well, now you did it. Is that what you wanted? Again, I am to blame for this. So it's my fault, as was losing to the Mets in 86, the Reds in 75, the Cardinals in 67, and the missing Danny Kaye. So, I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm so wounded by those childhood things, but they really did affect me for many, many years. And it was only with, well, actually in the middle of that, because this went on, but I did have a seed that really grew in my life, and that was a doctor, Cy Lussman, who was a friend of my family's. He was a therapist that I went to as a little kid. And some of you have heard this, so I apologize, but he made me feel like I mattered. I mean, my parents tried to. But when a stranger listens to you carefully and gives you a cookie, and you go regularly, it really began to make me believe that I mattered. But he also did something that was really, really curious. He made me understand the power of my imagination. Because every time I'd show up, he'd roll out some paper and take out a big bucket of magic markers, and he'd encourage me to use my imagination as a tool for motivation and fulfillment and agency. All important aspects of humanism and all important things that I try to bring to my work today. So he would take out this bucket and he'd encourage me to draw pictures of me being angry with John, being furious. And I ended up drawing after drawing of me attacking John in various ways. He was always usually at the center of the composition in various positions of symbolic surrender. On one mural, I had him in an underground bunker surrounded by my attacking armies, and he was on a shortwave radio crying out for help. There was a little sound bubble, help, help, SOS. And my tanks and my planes were converging, and I was at the controls of a B-52 with bombs ready to drop. Wow. Yeah. And Dr. Lussman would say, now don't tell your brothers about this, okay? It would only upset him. But he would give me the rolls, we put a rubber band on them, I'd bring them home, and I'd put them in my parents' closet way up top. Just our little secret. And remarkably, the symptoms that I had been suffering, which were these ridiculous nightmares night after night, disappeared. Now, as I said, you tell yourself these stories, and I don't know if that's what it was, but I really do believe that the imagination has such power to rewrite the stories that we have been given in our life. That feeling and acting like I was a failure, incapable of outwitting fate, and being without power was counteracted. I had power. It was in that pen that poured out onto the paper in the form of armaments and pointy weapons. But it made a difference. And it reminds us how fragile we are. So, a couple of years ago, I gave a talk here about psychological counseling that I want to touch on briefly. I'm not going to go over it again. But I was arguing that counseling can be a very meaningful tool for overcoming our limitations and for growing up psychically. And I argued that there's still way too much prejudice against therapy in this world. It's deeply wrong. I mean, therapy helps millions of people live more meaningful, exciting, satisfying, and joyous lives. But more of that at another time. But that was a piece of what I took away and what I bring now. It was also, I was lucky too, because I also lived in an environment where I could hold on to occasional moments of glory. There's a story that I've told way too many times, and I'll share it today. It was one that my wife puts up with constantly. It was about that one shining moment back in 1975 when I took home the gold. Last game of the season, captain of the lacrosse team playing our nemesis, Kingswood. We were the good guys, the home team. We were dressed in white with red piping. They were in brown helmets, and they were massive, and they were the evil empire. Their captains were Jeff Hickey and Joe Nastry, which we nicknamed Nasty. He was built like a water buffalo. And these guys were mean and cruel, and they thundered onto the field. And we were the underdog. They had beat us the year before at Kingswood for the championship, 8-7. So things were set up, right? It was a painful loss my junior year, but senior year, back at home, both teams undefeated in the league, this was the moment. I'm not going to tell you the story. My wife can tell you the story. She's memorized it. It's about every twist and turn of the game, every score, every momentary. But we won. We won. I made a save in the last 10 seconds. 25 teenagers in a mosh pit on a field. That was the crowning achievement of my high school career. Trivial, unimportant, foundational. Every time I felt down, I could, and still do, bring that memory back and tell myself, you can be a winner. So it helped for me. It taught me that it's important to feel joy, to have reckless abandon, and it can be over anything. It can be a ping pong match, for goodness sakes. But the resilience and the optimism that can be stimulated by these memories, the confidence and drive, and the flip side of how fragile we are. Remember the Red Sox, I tell myself. We're so affected by stories of struggle and sadness and breaking and retreating to heal and moving beyond. It engendered in me, I think, a sense of humility and an ability to accept my limitations in my ministry. It reminds me to laugh at myself, which is very useful, to be kind to others, and to admit childhood wounds and create narratives that help us lead more meaningful lives, to help us be more present and compassionate to other people and respectful to the ones we love, that help us commit to a world that can be cruel and tragic and make us feel powerless, but to still try to make a difference. Being in relationship with people means caring deeply about your commitment to them, regardless of how painful, regardless of how the world is beating you down. As my children grew up, I experienced another tremendous lesson of our humility and fragility in that my family went through some issues with addiction. Two of my close family members, my younger brother, and my mother, went through detox and treatment for a number of years. And it really reminded me that we all have feet of clay. We're all fragile. We need to be aware of our weakness and turn to each other for support. That's what this place is about, is turning to each other for support at times of weakness and sharing our joy in times of strength. It wasn't until 1997 that I had even heard of ethical culture. I started to go to the Washington Ethical Society because both my wife and I wanted our children to have a place where they could get a little religious literacy in a place of compassion and non-dogmatic proselytization. We wanted them to have some community to explore their ethical thinking. But as I began to go, I began to realize that I liked having a moment in the week for my own spiritual growth. My skepticism about religion and my personality kept me from jumping into life at the Washington Ethical Societies, but U.S. politics were getting worse and worse and worse for me at that time, and I was committed to try to do something a little better. I wanted to make a difference in the world, and I remember hearing Gandhi's famous answer to the question that was posed to him. He said, what do you think of Western civilization? And Gandhi said, I think it would be a good idea. And I thought it would be a good idea, which is why I went into ethical culture. I wanted to help create a real civilization based on humane and compassionate and rational behavior. I didn't just want to do what was possible, I wanted to change what was possible. I wanted to use my imagination to grow beyond where I had grown before. When I grew up, again, privileged, relatively comfortable, but it doesn't matter. We're still fragile when we're young, and we carry these wounds with us. I felt frustration and loss and disappointment. But these are first world problems. I was lucky enough to have experiences that taught me that I matter, that let me have the opportunity to develop a lively imagination, one that imagines a better world, than the one we live in today? A world where inherent worth is honored, relationships are grown, and justice is built? And I was lucky enough to get the tools to be strong enough to make a difference. Occasionally, even though I miss the show, or I lose the game, or I don't live up to my ideals like I would. I've been lucky enough to say we did it, we won, that we can make the world a better place. I've learned that it takes respect and commitment. And in growing ethical culture, I've learned the importance of resilience and joy and imagination, and deep and caring relationships that lead to caring congregations. Congregations that commit to each other because we know we all have a little kid inside of us. And we all have ideals that we want to live up to. Honest humility about human limitations and keeping a sense of humor about it helps us tell our stories, helps us retell our stories in ways that let us get beyond them. We need to choose to do that. We need to choose to take our wounds and our suffering and our frustration and transfer them into positive energy that helps us continue to believe in the ideals that we hold. But it's a choice, and that's what I want to leave you with. It's a choice what we do with our past and our wounds and our hurt. Choice is fundamental to the work that I do here. It's the heart of my existentialism, which I talked about a couple of years ago here. Other people may embrace choice very differently. I'm just going to share this last piece about how I do. It involved, for example, some writing I was involved with for the 2008 National Leaders Council statement of all ethical culture leaders. And in it, there were some words that meant a lot to me that I included them at the beginning of my Humanist Institute final project, which was a collection of writings that I entitled Living Ethical Culture, Reflections on My Humanist Faith. These are some of the words. Ethics begins with judgment and choice, and we know that how we choose to treat others is what is most important, as the kind of world we live in which radiates from personal decisions and interactions. Choice is uniquely mine. It's uniquely yours. We can't avoid it. Even if we don't choose, that's a choice we make. I know I have no choice but to take responsibility for my choices. And I make these choices in the context of a limited life, with limited information and limited time. I think that's an existential perspective, and I have it. And I chose ethical culture because I want to live ethically. I want to honor the worth of individuals, to nurture ethical relationships, and to build justice. And with that choice, I accept responsibility for trying to live out ideals. Ideals that I'll no doubt will fall short of. I know that. But in better days and in cooperation with others, some good work gets done. I think we honor these values best when we work with others to honor them. When we work together to support the little kid in us, to help grow up individually and in relationship into somebody with a sense of humor and a caring compassion and hope to inspire the rest of the world to be engaged in ethical culture. Thank you very much.